The North and South Poles are two of the most iconic geographic features the planet has to offer, thanks in no small part to them representing more or less the end of the Earth. You physically cannot go further north or south than these two places. But there are four cardinal directions and only two poles. Does an east or west pole exist? And if so, where is it? If not, why don't they exist? We'll get into that, but before we do so, I'd appreciate if you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Okay, so before we get into the possibility of an east or west pole, we need to dive into exactly what the north and south poles are. Coordinate systems on Earth are divided into two sections, latitude and longitude, with latitude being the north-south component of the coordinates and longitude being the east-west component. For example, New York City is at 40.7 degrees north of the equator and 74 degrees west of the prime meridian, which is set to run through the Greenwich Observatory in England. Latitude lines are parallel to each other due to the nature of the globe itself, with 1 degree of latitude always being approximately 70 miles or 110 kilometers. Latitude lines obviously start at the equator and they increment upwards until it reaches the north and south poles, which are at exactly 90 degrees north or south. The thing that makes the poles special is that it is impossible to go further from the equator while still being on Earth's surface. You can go downward or upward into space, but at that point you're moving off of Earth's coordinate system and into the coordinate system of the wider solar system, which is based off of the ecliptic plane. That's an entirely different discussion that I may or may not cover in the future. As far as Earth's surface goes, 90 degrees is the highest latitude you can get. If you start moving beyond the North Pole, for example, you will just start moving back south and your latitude will decrease. So, now that we know what makes the North and South Poles so special, what's different about East and West? Well, East and West relies on longitude instead of latitude, and longitude has a couple of properties that separate it from latitude. I mentioned that latitude lines are parallel at all times, with the distance between them always being the exact same. That's not the case for longitude lines, once again due to the nature of a globe. Longitude lines will always span the entire circumference of Earth, just like the equator does, while latitude lines form concentric circles that gradually get smaller as one approaches the poles. As a result, longitude lines are widest at the equator and then narrow as one gains latitude, eventually all intersecting at the north and south poles. This is one argument against a specific pole for east and west, but there's another thing that's arguably even more important. A maximum longitude does exist, and that's 180 degrees east or west of the aforementioned prime meridian, which falls pretty much in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. However, unlike north and south poles, you can continue moving east or west even after crossing this line. Your longitude will simply go from an increasing number of degrees west to a decreasing number of degrees east, or vice versa. There is nothing about this line that physically prevents you from continuing to move east or west. This is already bad enough, but the real nail in the coffin for an east or west pole, it would be completely arbitrary. You see, the north and south poles are based off of Earth's axis, and they are both a set distance from the equator, which is also set in stone. As a result of these two variables, no matter how we center our maps, the poles will always remain at the same locations unless we somehow change the planet itself. This isn't the case for longitude. The generally accepted baseline for longitude today is the prime meridian, which, as mentioned before, is set to run through the Greenwich Observatory. This, however, is completely arbitrary and can be changed whenever humanity feels like it. For example, another possible prime meridian that could be used is the so-called Washington Meridian, which would pass through a landmark in Washington, D.C., either the White House or the Capitol building. Since D.C. is very close to 77 degrees west, this would put the maximum east-west line at what is now the 133rd meridian east, which runs through eastern Russia, China, and Southeast Asia before jetting out into the eastern Indian Ocean. This is just one of many examples of prime meridians that have been proposed, and they would all change where 180 degrees east or west would be, and thus the location of a theoretical east or west pole. There is simply nothing preventing humanity from changing the prime meridian, at least not in the same way as the equator or poles. That being said, we can still work with what we're given to find the theoretical east or west pole. One issue with defining a specific pole location as the 180 line itself isn't a specific point like the real poles are, but rather a line that extends from the North Pole to the South Pole. However, there is one specific spot that stands out to me personally, and that's where the 180 line and the equator intersect, which happens to be a point in the middle of the Pacific Ocean not far from Howland Island, which is famous for being a possible location where Amelia Earhart's plane crashed. This location is notable because it is the absolute furthest you can get from the prime meridian, with it being half of Earth's circumference away in either direction. As a result, this location would in theory be the furthest east or west you can go. And speaking of which, since the 180 line is both 180 degrees east and 180 degrees west, this would mean that this remote location in the Pacific would be both the east and west poles. If that's weird to you, then we can add another pole at the antipode, or location on Earth's surface that's directly underneath the east-west pole. This puts us at 0 degrees east and west, 0 degrees north and south. This is what's known as Knoll Island, which isn't a real island, but rather a weather buoy that's anchored in the Gulf of Guinea. So using this, we'd have both an east-west pole and a so-called knoll pole, where the coordinates are 0. But once again, with the prime meridian itself being arbitrary, the location of these poles would be arbitrary as well. But hey, gotta work with what we got. And that's all I have to say about poles. As always, I'd appreciate you like the video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the notification bell to stay tuned for future content. Thanks and have a great day.